Welcome to Abide in Liberty, a podcast empowering patriots everywhere to re-enthrone faith, family, and freedom as the bedrock pillars of liberty in education, our communities, and our nation.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Abide in Liberty. I am Braden Hayes, your host. I wanted to begin this time by addressing some of the social media comments that I received this past week. It was actually all a single commenter, and he brought up a few different quotes from a few of the different founding fathers to show just how unreligious and deistic our founding fathers are. One of them was supposedly a quote by Thomas Jefferson, and here's what he said that Thomas Jefferson said: "Christianity is the most perverted system that ever shone on man." Now, according to Monticello.org, his comment on Christianity is a little bit paraphrased, and it's an excerpt from a letter that was written by Thomas Jefferson to Joseph Priestley. Seems to be a common theme here, people taking letters and things that Thomas Jefferson says in letters out of context and misapplying them. Here's what he actually was saying: "This was the real ground of all the attacks on you. Those who live by mystery and charlatanry, fearing you would render them useless by simplifying the Christian philosophy, the most sublime and benevolent, but most perverted system that ever shone on man, endeavored to crush your well-earned and well-deserved fame." Based on the out-of-context quote that Christianity is the most perverted system that ever shone on man, it would sound like he's calling the Christian religion perverted and wrong somehow. But when you look at the actual quote, right before he said that, he called Christianity the most sublime and benevolent. But then he follows that up with most perverted. So in the context of the letter itself, and when you look at this in context of everything else positive that Thomas Jefferson had to say about Christianity, his meaning becomes pretty obvious. And that's that people throughout history have perverted Christianity, which in truth is sublime and benevolent. And you don't have to look any further than the many atrocities that have been committed in the name of Christianity. But remember, labels don't make it Christianity any more than, calling it the People's Republic of China makes it any less communistic. You got to look at the acts. You got to look at what's going on underneath it. So Thomas Jefferson doesn't hate Christianity. Never did, and never said that. In another comment, this same person quoted a guy named Thomas Paine, where he was basically demonizing the Bible and the Christian faith. Now, Thomas Paine was a major player in the Revolutionary War. Before the colonists declared independence, he wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense, and it was this pamphlet that, in large part, galvanized the colonies to go ahead and declare independence from Great Britain. This pamphlet was hugely influential in that decision. Later on, after the Revolutionary War had already begun and America had declared its independence, later in that same year, so in December of 1776, he released another pamphlet called Common Sense. And it was published just before Christmas and just before the crossing of the Delaware, where Washington went and earned that incredible victory with his ragtag, freezing to death army. Here's the opening paragraph of that pamphlet, The Crisis, that Washington caused to be read to his men before crossing the Delaware. It says, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated. Britain, with an army to enforce her tyranny, has declared that she has a right not only to tax, but to bind us in all cases whatsoever. And if being bound in that manner is not slavery, Then is there not such a thing as slavery upon the earth? Even the expression is impious, for so unlimited a power can belong only to God. And again, I just want to reiterate his influence during this period cannot be overstated. The influence of Thomas Paine on the founding of our nation was immense, especially in the early days of the American Revolution. Now, nearly 20 years later in the 1790s, he published another pamphlet called Age of Reason, where he elevated reason and attacked God, Christianity, and the Bible in particular as demonic. Because of that, for years after this, American schools forbade students from studying his works, including all of those beautiful words that I just read that were filled with God and heavenly references. People change, and Thomas Paine did, and he lost a lot of his influence and he lost the respect of many of the founders when he turned on the faith that so many of them held so dear. Now, it's important also just to remember that Thomas Paine was not involved in the Constitutional Convention, nor was he a part of the Congress that proposed and worked to get the Bill of Rights put through. So using him as an authority for interpreting the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and what they meant with regards to religion is inappropriate, if not blatantly misleading. This same commenter also brought up a quote by James Madison where he expresses his desire to have more of a separation of church and state than what he was seeing than what many of the founding fathers wanted at the time. And we talked about this in my last episode. James Madison definitely was influential in the Constitutional Convention and in the drafting of the Bill of Rights. He's not called the father of the Constitution for nothing. But remember, in interpreting what the original intent of the Constitution and what the Bill of Rights is, it's important to look at what did the community and the nation at large, those who adopted and voted to adopt the Constitution and ratify the Bill of Rights, what did all of them think it meant? And when you weigh what all of the founders and all the citizens thought the First Amendment meant against what James Madison later in life wanted it to mean, his opinion just gets overwhelmed. But even still, he didn't want the modern interpretation and the modern attack that we've seen on religion. Otherwise, he wouldn't have regularly attended church services in the Capitol building. So all of these comments and all these quotes and these references show just how weak the foundation is that modern courts have built their interpretation of religion and the Constitution on. You simply have to refer to out of context quotes, people who weren't even significantly involved, or only focus on an extreme interpretation of a single, albeit influential person. You have to ignore hundreds and thousands of references from founders and citizens, a veritable mountain of evidence, and you have to ignore the historical context that gave birth to the First Amendment in the first place. Now, as I was reading these comments, the thought that kept coming to me was how many out there just accept erroneous quotes like these and statements like them as true without even questioning them. We have got to know the truth so that we can defend these blatantly false and bad faith claims. How many of us hesitate to engage in a conversation with someone because we just aren't sure of the facts, so we stay quiet? We've got to defend what is true with respect, but we have got to be rock solid in our convictions and in our understanding of what is actually true. We need to know what separation of church and state actually means. We need to know what the intent of the Second Amendment was when it was passed. We need to understand the limitations placed on the federal government and why those limitations were put there. The answers to all of these things are crystal clear because the founders, the Federalist Papers, a multitude of letters and convention notes are abundant and explain very clearly what the founders intended by these things. These are not debatable by anyone who actually cares more about truth than about getting their own way. And there are a lot of people out there who choose the temper tantrum route rather than historical truth because a temper tantrum is so much easier than convincing people on the basis of fact and sound argument and then going through the legal process to pass an amendment. If you don't like what the First Amendment says, or the Second Amendment, or the limitations placed on federal government power, this is, at least for now, sort of a free country. And you cannot like it. You cannot like what those things mean and the way that the people who passed those laws intended them to be. You can hold peaceful rallies to try and get people to support your cause and your beliefs. You can present your facts, and you can even present your lies to your followers in an attempt to persuade them to your point of view. All of that is allowed in this country. But if those lies gain traction and convince people to change their minds because those of us who should know they are lies and are either ignorant or too lazy to do something about it, then shame on us. This week in school, our devotional virtue was honesty. And one of the things we learned about honesty is that, yes, it is intentionally telling a mistruth, but dishonesty is also allowing somebody to believe something is false by our silence. And there are a lot of us out there, myself included, who have been guilty of allowing people to believe lies because we are either scared of speaking the truth or haven't put in the work to make sure we know what the truth actually is. And one of the biggest excuses that I used to make for myself and still do many times, and one of the excuses that I've heard expressed by many people before, is that I'm just too busy. I've got too much going on. And yes, that's true for many of us. We do have a lot going on. Life is incredibly busy. But how you spend your time matters. When my wife and I started this school, I was still working full time, and I was taking care of the administrative and bookkeeping stuff on the weekends and on the evenings. But because my wife is now working full time, and it was really more like 2 full-time jobs to get the school started for the role that she was taking on, I took over all the housework, all the grocery shopping, all the laundry, everything. And I felt like there was no way that I was going to find that much time. But what I found was that God squeezed out a lot of fluff from my life that I didn't even know was there, that I didn't even recognize as fluff. A couple years later, when it became my turn to teach full-time, and I still was working part-time at my prior job during this transition, I thought all that fluff had already been burned away. I was stripped to the bone at this point, and I wasn't. Again, there were things in my life that God burned out and that were replaced by what He wanted me to do. And right now, 3-4 years later, I feel the same way, that I've got all that I can handle. But I know based on prior experiences that there's more fluff. There are more rough edges that can be knocked off. One time in the middle of all of this, when I was feeling particularly overwhelmed, I talked to my mom and asked her advice on how to handle all these competing priorities. And she told me what she's tried to do since before she started the school up in St. George, Utah, years and years ago. She said every day she wakes up and in her morning prayers asks God to tell her how He wants her to spend her time that day. In other words, let Him populate her to-do list. And as she's done that, she's found herself magnified, and she's found that the unimportant things just tend to fall aside. And I, over the past few years, have really tried hard to put that into practice. And one thing I've learned is that it's hard. And I find myself reading fewer and fewer entertainment novels and watching TV a whole lot less than I used to be. I spend a whole lot less time researching hobbies and things that I was interested in than I would have if I were just going off and doing what I wanted to do. And one thing I've learned about me from my life, and I think this probably applies to a lot of us, is that if we're too busy to do what's right, then we need to find what's wrong in our lives or what is not of eternal significance in our lives and cut it out. If any of this feels overwhelming, or if you feel that you're not equal to the task, I've got great news. You're not. Remember, you've got God on your side, and with Him, you are enough. Remember that relying on God in the public square and in political debate, and I talked about this in prior episodes, it's not weakness, it makes you strong. Remember that although a belief in God may not be able to be proved scientifically, it is not a position of weakness, and it's not logically inferior to the atheistic doctrine widely accepted in our country. Atheism will claim they are not a religion and that it requires no faith whatsoever, but it does. Choosing to view the world as if God doesn't exist is equally a leap of faith because you can't prove he doesn't. And you can't prove that your worldview is the accurate one. Science can't help you here, so stop feeling inferior. Your belief does not make you weak or out of touch. It makes you strong. And when you act on that faith, you forge a direct line with the creator of the universe himself. And nothing is better than that. That being said, you still have to put in the homework. God can't pull from an empty vessel. And that's the goal that I have for this podcast. It's meant to be educational and teach truths from a godly perspective. It's meant to help you articulate and defend the truth that we're learning about here. And if at any point after listening to a specific topic or a specific episode, if you ever feel like you're still ill-equipped to answer questions about these truths or defend them, then please head over to the Abide in Liberty YouTube channel and leave a comment with your question or your concern or your request for clarification. Your feedback will help me see holes in my own reasoning, and together we can learn better to be instruments in God's hands for defending the freedom that he's blessed us with. And real quick, I want to address an attack that has been thrown my way before, and that's that I'm not a lawyer, so how can I possibly be an authority on what the Constitution means? And I want to point something out here. I carry around a little pocket Constitution. This is a small little booklet, and the entire Constitution fits in about 23 pages in this little teeny tiny booklet. The Arizona Title 15, which is all about public education in the state of Arizona, is hundreds of pages long. But that doesn't include things like the tax code, the criminal code, probate law, accounting law, building codes, copyright, patents, trademarks, contract law, real estate law, business law, and the list goes on. And then it gets even more mind-blowing, the amount of law that's out there, when you look that most of these laws also have a version at the local town level, at the county level, at the state level, and at the federal level. The body of law in this country is staggering and astounding, and you need a lawyer to navigate all of that. But you do not need a lawyer to navigate 23 teeny tiny little pages. This was written for the common person. It was farmers and craftsmen and merchants who were reading it, debating it, sending their delegates to the conventions to vote on it. This was meant for you to understand. You can understand it, and you don't need a 3-year law degree to do it. One last point I want to make before moving on. In all of this, as we're learning and defending truth, we have got to maintain the moral high ground. We have got to be grounded in principles and not allow ourselves to get sucked into the petty backbiting and name-calling that has infected our political debate in the political sphere. Both sides are doing this, and it's wrong. It's time for America to grow up and stop acting like squabbling toddlers. Focus on principles, stand up for those principles, stand up for God, stand up for truth, and support those who support those principles, who are going to defend those principles with you. Earlier today, I was listening to an interview with Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earl Sears, who is the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia. And this interview is kind of what cemented in my mind what I was going to talk about in this week's episode. At one point in this interview, she said, "You must confront the darkness. It's really that simple. There is wickedness. There is darkness in the world, and we must make the darkness tremble." The first thing that came to my mind when she said that was what was said about Captain Moroni. "If all men had been and were and ever would be like unto Moroni, behold, the very powers of hell would have been shaken forever. Yea, the devil would never have power over the hearts of the children of men. If we were all righteous like that, we would make darkness tremble. The very powers of hell would be shaken. I love that imagery, and that is what we are doing here. That is what we are called as disciples of Christ to do. In Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 and 2, it says, I saw an angel come down from heaven, having the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years. So this is talking about the millennium, when Christ returns and Satan is bound and he's not able to tempt God's children for 1,000 years. And here's the key for how we make that happen, how we make hell tremble so much that it is powerless. 1 Nephi chapter 22, verse 26 says, and because of the righteousness of his people, Satan has no power. Wherefore he cannot be loosed for the space of many years, for he hath no power over the hearts of the people, for they dwell in righteousness, and the Holy One of Israel reigneth. Darkness trembles, hell shakes, and Satan is bound by righteousness. Satan has no power if we don't give it to him. When we are with God and Jesus, Satan can't come close. And we don't get to that point by sitting down and shutting up. If we're not prepared to bear Christ's cross today, to suffer the shame of the world today, to stand up and tell Satan no today, we will not be deserving of that millennial rest and peace later. Now is the day of our repentance. Now is when we show God whose side we are on. And I'm not talking about the Republican or Democrat side, but are we on his side? Are we on the side of truth and right? Or do we let evil run roughshod while we sit in the corner silent and afraid? Edmund Burke, who's a British philosopher and statesman, once said, when bad men combine, the good must associate, meaning the good people have to stick together, else they will fall one by one. Now back to Captain Moroni. In his time, a guy named Malachi rose up and tried to overthrow the government and set himself up as a king. He could have just not done anything. He could have said, I guess the people want this. I guess people want Malachi to be a king. We'll just let this play itself out. But he didn't. He stood up and he went and wrote on his coat the title of liberty. He waved it in the streets and invited people to join him in resisting this evil. And that is the kind of person that would cause the very powers of hell to shake forever. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the Bible could have bowed and confined their rebellion to their thoughts. But they didn't. They stood up in front of everybody and risked life and limb to defend God. Daniel could have stopped praying. David could have taken one look at that giant and turned around and head right back home. Moses could have still backed down and refused to believe that God could overcome his slowness of speech. Each of them in their way and in their time pushed back the darkness and made it tremble. They're in the scriptures, and we read those stories because they are examples we should all be following. So how do we push back the darkness growing in our country? In 1987, Ezra Taft Benson had a lot to say on this topic, and I'm going to read several quotes from him here in order. He said, unfortunately, we as a nation have apostatized in various degrees from different constitutional principles as proclaimed by the inspired founders. For centuries, our forefathers suffered and sacrificed that we might be the recipients of the blessings of freedom. If they were willing to sacrifice so much to establish us as a free people, should we not be willing to do the same to maintain that freedom for ourselves and for future generations? The Lord said, therefore, I, the Lord, justify you and your brethren of my church in befriending that law, which is the constitutional law of the land. He then asks, how then can we best befriend the Constitution in this critical hour and secure the blessings of liberty and ensure the protection and guidance of our Father in heaven? First and foremost, we must be righteous. John Adams said, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Second, we must learn the principles of the Constitution in the tradition of the founding fathers. Have we read, this is still him talking, have we read the Federalist Papers? Are we reading the Constitution and pondering it? Are we aware of its principles? Are we abiding by these principles and teaching them to others? Could we defend the Constitution? Can we recognize when a law is constitutionally unsound? Do we know what the prophets have said about the Constitution and the threats to it? As Jefferson said, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be. Third, we must become involved in civic affairs to see that we are properly represented. We must follow this counsel from the Lord. Honest men and wise men should be sought for diligently, and good and wise men ye should observe to uphold. Otherwise, whatsoever is less than these cometh of evil. Fourth, we must make our influence felt by our vote, our letters, our teaching, and our advice. We must become accurately informed and then let others know how we feel. In conclusion, I've heard many people say something like, we just have to hang in there and bear it until Christ comes again. The world is so wicked. We're just at the enduring to the end phase here. And what a defeatist mentality that is. It's like saying that, there's nothing that we can do to stop evil, so I've just got to deal with it until Christ comes and fixes it all for us. This attitude is not taught anywhere in the scriptures. Christ did not teach pacifism. He was a mover and a shaker, and he transformed the world. He did it without hate, he did it without spite, and he did it without violence, mostly. But he was not a silent bystander. And what was his invitation to us? Follow me. Do what you have seen me do. His disciples, after his resurrection, continued to push back the darkness. What makes us think that the way we get on his side is just to stand on the sidelines and let evil run rampant? Yes, he will come and usher in a reign of peace, but those who are caught up to meet him are those who live every moment of every day doing their best to follow him and prepare the world for his coming. And that is an active, it's a brave, and it's a courageous sort of discipleship. We can be that kind of disciple. We must be that kind of disciple. Let's learn it, let's defend it, and let's do it together. Join me next week.
Thank you for listening to Abide in Liberty. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes, and share this with friends and family. In the meantime, keep up with the show online at abideinliberty.com. Also, if you'd like to help our K-12 bless and educate more families, contact us by visiting libertyyouthacademy.org. Until next time, be on the alert, stand firm in the faith, and be strong.